Welcome to You and Your Democracy. It's a short take civics lesson as part of our program, Where Do We Go From Here? I'm Chuck Parkinson. Each episode, we will look at the head and heart of democracy. We will explore the values and the principles that have created our American exceptionalism and examine the structures and institutions that give us the guardrails of our democratic republic. To quote Benjamin Franklin when asked in 1787 after the Constitutional Convention, "Doctor, what have we got, a republic or monarchy?" To which Franklin responded with a rejoinder at once witty and ominous, "A republic if you can keep it." So now let's take a look at what is this great American experiment, and then ask, what do we need to do to keep it? In today's episode, we are discussing why democracy, and what is the role or value of democracy. I am pleased to be joined by Dr. John Van Benthuysen, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Black Hills State University. Thanks for joining us today, John.
It's good to be with you, Chuck.
Well, let's just jump right in. One of the things we talk about is why democracy?
Well, my answer to that question is because of the alternatives. If we think about what an alternative to democracy would look like, it's going to be either oligarchy or dictatorship. And these are systems of government where the few rule over the many. And this creates problems. You can get lucky. Sometimes these types of governments will have a good leader. One can think of recently Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew or Deng Xiaoping of China. But more commonly, you're likely to get a Stalin or a Pol Pot. And so when you ask that question, why democracy, it really hinges upon the types of leaders you have and how legitimate government is, because government by oligarchy and dictatorship frequently lacks legitimacy, it's arbitrary, and it's cruel. And so really at the heart of this question, why democracy, it boils down to legitimacy.
And that's a very important point, I think, that we all need to think about is the legitimacy, where in the early days of our democracy and the decision to go that particular route, the founding fathers and a lot of the statements that were made in that manner of why democracy and why go that direction goes to the very point that you had touched on that. And I think that as we follow through, we continue to see that on a daily basis. As we look at that, you touched on the heart, the basic heart of democracy. And could we expand a little bit about the role of the people and the part and the job that you literally, as Lincoln indicated, that what the government is, it's by the people and for the people and of the people. So could you expand a little bit on that?
Yes, I'll try. The founding generation was very influenced by a lot of different political philosophers of that era. And one important one was John Locke, who was a political theorist in England, who lived under essentially a constitutional monarchy, but one that could abuse its authority. He wrote his famous treatise on politics with a pseudonym for fear of being thrown in jail. And he came up with a radical idea that government is legitimate to the extent it's based on the consent of the people. And so this is where democracy kind of gains its legitimacy, is that it is constantly referring to the public, usually with the institutional mechanism of elections. We have regular elections for the House every 2 years, for the Senate every 6 years, for the executive office every 4 years. And these are periodic checks where government is renewed, its legitimacy is renewed by the consent of the people through the act of voting. And this is why voting and elections really lie at the heart of a democratic system of government, and probably what most people think of when they hear the word democracy. They'll typically think of casting a ballot, standing in a long line to cast a ballot, as the case may be. But this is the critical essence of democracy. And we face a challenge, I think, in this country because we don't have a good track record of civic participation in the area of voting. If you look at national turnout for presidential elections, and these are kind of, big, huge events, popularized on the media, you would think that they would galvanize people to get out. But we they frequently do not. And so even though our last election was considered the most important election of our generation, maybe 60% of the citizenry who are eligible to vote actually cast their ballot. And that raises questions in the mind of some on how legitimate is a democratic government if so few are actually participating in the process. It gets worse, unfortunately, when you look at elections just below the executive office. Midterm elections for members of the House, it's not unusual for turnout to plummet to 30%. If you go to the state level, especially local community governments, it really falls off a cliff. And it is not unusual, unfortunately, for election turnout to fall below 10% in a lot of small towns and cities across the country. And that really does raise, in my mind, how legitimate is a democracy that doesn't have the citizens actually participating.
Yeah, that brings to mind, it's not a new issue, of course, from that standpoint, because a quote that I saw not long ago as I was doing some preparation for this program was from Thomas Jefferson, who said, "We in America do not have a government by the majority, we have a government by the majority who participate." And it goes right to what you were just talking about. And we see that at that point where democracy, it can be raised, the question could be, is the democracy really legitimate when those people choose not to participate, whether they say that my vote doesn't count, or nobody listens to me and I'm not going to vote because I don't like either of the two candidates that have been offered for election. What would you say as looking at it purely from a democracy standpoint? What kind of advice might you give people that might have that point of view?
That's a tough question, a fraught question in our current kind of political environment, because when I get this question a lot from students, why should I bother voting? Nothing is ever going to change. And a lot of times I want to respond, well, if your vote didn't matter, uh, then why are we seeing purges of voter counts in a lot of states? Why are we seeing the suppression of voters in minority communities and impoverished communities in this country? Uh, some people think that it matters very much. Voting is really much provides the keys to power and authority in our system of government. And in our system, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, and we squeak by voting, really. And if you're not voting, you're not squeaking, and you're not going to get the grease, so to speak. It's a tired analogy, but I'm a bit old-fashioned, I guess, in that regard.
Well, I think it hits home. It really is. The squeaky wheel does get the attention, and we see that quite frequently on when certain decisions are made. When you look at the fact that at all different levels of government, oftentimes the things that get the first attention is that very thing. And but of course that's part of the as the old saying goes, elections have consequences. And that's a part of the democratic process. When we look at democracy in that realm, you mentioned on the fact is with the voter turnout about the fact where you get to state and local elections that just get almost to the point of non-existence. It's a sad affair, and how do we because considering the value of democracy, how do we get, what might we do to get people more
How do we break through to the masses
what is a
and
breakthrough?
convince them that this is important, not just as an abstract ideal, but for their day-to-day lives? Well, in political science, as you might imagine, we spend a lot of time trying to identify who in fact votes and try to draw some conclusions that might help us expand the number of people who do so. So, according to decades of political science research, we have a lot of confidence on who votes. And so, generally speaking, the characteristics of someone who votes regularly and consistently is someone with a lot of education, someone who is older, and someone who is wealthier. And so those three kind of attributes highly correlate with voting consistently, not just in presidential elections, but in midterm elections and their local elections, up and down the Democratic board, so to speak. And so that indirectly identifies who's not voting, right? So it is people with comparatively less education, less wealth, and younger people. And so this data, it can potentially help us focus on our message in terms of trying to get more people to take voting seriously, to take their civic responsibility of voting seriously. We need to focus on young people, people with less wealth, and people with less education. That is the target community, and frankly, that represents the vast majority of American citizens.
Well, that's a good direction to go. And as we wind down this conversation, any last thoughts that you might have that you would like to leave our viewers and listeners with?
I'm tempted to quote Churchill on his defense of democracy. So he kind of, I'm paraphrasing here, but he famously said that democracy is the worst type of government, except for all the others that human beings have tried from time to time. So uh, I understand as a human being and a political scientist that democracy can be frustrating. We don't always get what we want, but it really is the best alternative to a different type of government, which, as we discussed earlier, is more likely to be an oligarchy or a dictatorship. So we should be fortunate and cherish our democracy and take it seriously, and hopefully we'll get there.
John, that's a great thought to leave things with today. That's our episode for now. I want to thank John Benthuysen for sharing his expertise and thoughts with us today. And as always, our executive producer, Suzanne Stratford, and the SDPB technical staff for their creativity and hard work on this program. Thank you also to the supporters of South Dakota Public Broadcasting who make this program possible. To view previous episodes in this series, go to sdpb.org/election. If you have comments or suggestions for future episodes, send us a note at programming@sdpb.org. Until our next short take, I'm Chuck Parkinson.